In this video, we're going to talk about Johns Hopkins University, the pros, the cons, and how to get in. Johns Hopkins is a top-tier private university. It's located in Baltimore, Maryland, which is about an hour north of DC. And it's a relatively small university with about 5,500 undergraduates. Johns Hopkins is primarily known for its STEM programs, including its undergraduate engineering school and its pre-med program. And there are a ton of students who go to Johns Hopkins specifically for pre-med, whether to major in biology, neuroscience, bioengineering, or public health. You can't talk about Johns Hopkins without talking about their world-class research. Johns Hopkins was actually founded as the very first research university in America. And each year, Johns Hopkins gets far more research funding than any other university in America. And it's really not even close. So if you look at the year 2022, for example, which is really just indicative of what it's been like over the past few decades, Johns Hopkins got about $3.5 billion in research funding for a wide variety of projects. And the closest university to that was UC Berkeley, which got about half that, or $1.8 billion. And the reason that's important is that you need to understand that world-class research is the core identity of Johns Hopkins. So if you want to go there and you want to have really any chance of getting in, you need to acknowledge that, and you need to make that a big part of the reason why you intend to go there. What are some of the pros? Well, the first pros are the unparalleled research opportunities. About 90% of students who go to Johns Hopkins engage in some type of undergraduate research, and many students do much more than one research project. And it's important to know that even though the school is best known for medical research, they really excel in all kinds of research. So if you want to study anthropology or political science or linguistics, or really anything at all which involves world-class research, it's a perfect place for you. And because this school is relatively small and there's so many research opportunities going on, it's very easy to get involved. A second pro is that Johns Hopkins has a really strong pre-med program. About 70% of students who enroll there are pre-med students. And once students graduate from the college, about 85% of them who apply to medical school get in. So it's a really good track for getting into top medical schools. And part of the reason is not just that they've got great professors and great research, but they also give you easy access to shadow local doctors, or to work in a clinic, or to volunteer in medical capacities in Baltimore. So the entire program really sets students up really well to excel on the pre-med track. A third pro is that Johns Hopkins has something called pilot programs, which are peer-led study groups. And they limit these study groups to between 6 and 10 students, and they all have a student leader who's specifically trained to do this. And the whole idea is that it helps students collaborate on all their homework for all their different classes, and it makes it a collaborative experience, and it gives you a support system. And a final pro is that Johns Hopkins has a lot of ethnic diversity. The school definitely skews a bit Asian, but if you look at how the undergraduate student body breaks down, it's about 30% Asian, 20% Latino, 20% white, 15% African American, and 15% international. And that's much more diverse in general than the other schools at this caliber, like the Ivy Leagues. What are some of the cons? Well, the first cons is that Johns Hopkins is incredibly rigorous. The academics here are notoriously difficult, which puts it on par with schools like University of Chicago, Princeton, MIT, Caltech, and Swarthmore. Students here work really hard. The school is considered a grind school, and it's not uncommon for students to spend their entire weekend in the library, and there's not a lot of work-life balance. The other thing to know is that grading here is done very harshly. There's no grade inflation like you see at some other schools. And this is important because if your goal, for example, is to get into med school, your GPA is a critical factor. And just because you went to a difficult school like Johns Hopkins doesn't mean that they're going to give you a pass. So if you don't think that you can excel here, you might be better off going to a school that's slightly less rigorous. A second con is that Johns Hopkins isn't known for being a fun school. So you compare it with another school like Duke, for example, which has a really good pre-med program. But students at Duke tend to be really happy. They tend to follow the sports teams, and they tend to really enjoy the social scene. So just know that when you go to Johns Hopkins, you're going there to work and not to play. And a third con is the city of Baltimore itself. While some students like Baltimore and they think it's diverse and has a lot to offer, it's known for having a lot of high crime areas, and you really have to be careful anytime you venture off campus. I would say that Baltimore is similar to maybe Chicago or New Haven, Connecticut, or some parts of New York City, where you really have to be street savvy and really pay attention to what you're doing. How to get into Johns Hopkins. The first thing you have to do is make sure you spell the name of the university correctly. It's Johns Hopkins, Johns. It's not John Hopkins, and it's also not Johns Hopkins with an apostrophe. And sometimes small things like that can actually make a big difference on your application. The second thing you could do is talk about research. More than anything else, Johns Hopkins is known for the research. So you need to make sure in your college application that you talk about how you want to take advantage of this when you get to college, and also ideally how you've already done this in high school. The third thing you can do is to be different. You have to understand that the vast majority of students who apply to Johns Hopkins are applying for engineering or pre-medicine. So if you apply to the university for anything else, you're automatically going to stand out. If you want to go into behavioral psychology or comparative government or some other humanities field or social science, you'll have a much better chance of getting in. A fourth thing you can do is show ambition. A key characteristic of Johns Hopkins students is that they are highly ambitious. That means you want to talk about how in high school you were hungry for difficult challenges and you never shied away from academic rigor. They're looking for students who thrive by going out of their comfort zone and taking on really difficult projects. And a fifth thing that you can do is apply early decision. Johns Hopkins is one of those schools that has two different early decision plans. There's early decision 1, which is in November, and there's early decision 2, which is in January. They're both binding, and statistically, students have a better chance of getting in when they apply early decision 1, but early decision 2 does still give you some advantages. The difference between applying early decision and regular decision is you have about double the admissions odds. So maybe the regular decision rate is about a 6% acceptance rate, and early decision overall is about 13%. You need to understand that some of that is because the early decision applicant pool is better typically, so more of those students are going to get in. But still in general, it's helpful to know that about a third of students at Johns Hopkins get in through the early decision process, so they definitely favor those kinds of students. And one final note about the fact that Johns Hopkins is test optional. Normally, if a student is applying to any top 30 ranked university, I would strongly recommend to them that they submit either their SAT score or their ACT score. But Johns Hopkins is a little bit different. So for their class of 2027, for example, about 40% of freshmen got in without submitting either of their scores, which is really high. So I think with Johns Hopkins, it's one of those rare cases where they look mostly at your grades and the rigor of the courses you took and teacher recommendations and other things, and they don't give as much attention to your standardized test scores. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me directly. I'll put my email in the video description.